Hello, welcome back to Disasters Deconstructed. Hey, Sanya, how's it going?
Good. I think you caught me on the last moment of dance. I forgot to stop dancing.
I
It's
just I
great.
just stopped. I did a twirl just before we came on, but yeah. So I heard just as we were preparing that we're the first humans that you're speaking to today. So welcome to
You are
today.
the
Welcome
first
to Human
humans.
Interaction.
I know. This is incredible, right? But also, not only you're the first humans I'm talking to today, you're pretty much the first kind of grown-up adult humans who are able to talk since maybe Friday, because I spent the weekend with the toddler doing choo choo and speaking in 3-word sentences. So if all of a sudden I start mimic inanimate objects and give them characteristics and call them by the names, please do not judge. My brain is somewhat disengaged.
Well, that's all part of being human, right?
Or not.
So,
This is a difficult question. Philosophical. And that is why that is why we put together the volume that is hopefully will be called Contemplating Catastrophe, because we like contemplate, right? And not just about catastrophe, but about other things. And for those of you who are joining us today, if you missed the first couple of episodes, this is what this season is about. Basically, Jason and I had this yet another amazing idea, even if we say so ourselves, where we wanted to invite our colleagues, our comrades, our friends to contribute an essay where they engage with their favorite thinker, or maybe the thinker that challenges them most, who wrote or who writes and who works outside of disaster studies, and then to tell us why that thinker is so important for disaster scholarship. And it's been really great to read those entries, those essays, and we really cannot wait to share them with you when they're published. But for now, we're talking to the people who wrote these entries for us. And so today we're going to have a pretty broad conversation about catastrophe, urbanism, technology, and kind of all this other weird and wonderful things that keep us all up at night. So we'll see where the conversation will lead us.
yeah, so we're excited about this third episode of this season. We have some special guests today. Joining us are some scholars, like our first episode with JC and AJ. They contributed pieces to our volume, and they are Kevin Grove and Zachary Loeb. And for those of you who have been following Disasters Deconstructed, you may already know Zachary. It's great to have him back with us. And Kevin, we would like to welcome you to the podcast. So we're going to bring you both on screen. Welcome, both of you.
Hi.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for having us.
For sure. So brief intros. Zachary is a historian of technology, disasters, and technological disasters at Purdue University. He's interested in the end of the world. Wow, okay. More specifically, his research focuses on the idea that humanity's romance with technology has and the planet on a course that may lead to catastrophe. He's currently working on a book project on the year 2000 computer problem, better known as Y2K. And there is an episode somewhere in our archive where we discussed this, which was a cool conversation. Kevin Grove is a professor of geography at the Florida International University. He's a political geographer interested in exploring how human-environment relations are governed in the context of contemporary crises. Welcome to both of you.
Yay! It's great to have you. And we have quite a conversation prepared for you, so this is going to be a lot of fun. But we want to start, as we start with all the episodes in this season, with kind of a chat about your inspiration. So we basically want to learn what inspires your thinking, how you work, how you read, how you do your scholarship. So, Zachary, I'll start with you. What do you read? And how have you started reading the stuff that you're reading now? What inspired you in your work?
So in terms of, in particular, the stuff that inspired this work, the particular scholars that I picked from here, it kind of goes back to my early days as a librarian, and in particular, when I was in library school, one of the questions that was really fascinating me was the way that technology was talked about by librarians, the way that libraries were thought of as technological spaces, and this kind of weird tension that I was detecting between, on the one hand, there was often this attitude that made it seem like libraries were these kind of like technologically resistant spaces versus my experience in libraries, seeing many of them being like very, very technologically advanced, being very, very technologically optimistic. And this led me to start really reading into kind of critiques of technology. And at first, I was really doing a lot of reading of people like Neil Postman and some other media theorists. And then in reading that sort of work, I kind of wound up doing some like backtracking. Like I would be reading them and I would try and find, okay, who are the people they are drawing on? Who are the readers? Who are the thinkers? Who are the figures who are inspiring them? And it was through Postman and a couple of other figures in that area that I really came across Lewis Mumford. And after I started reading Lewis Mumford, it was kind of all over for me. I have spent way too much of my life probably now devouring his rather sizable body of work. And I also had the privilege of, while I was getting my PhD, getting to spend a fair amount of time digging through his archive, reading correspondence, all sorts of odds and ends there. And for me, that kind of just really, really got me very, very interested in 20th century critics of technology, how people were theorizing technology, how they were thinking about technology, how they were predicting future risks associated with technology throughout the 20th century. Became very interested in what they got right, what they got wrong, how their warnings were accepted, how their warnings were reacted to. And that has kind of been one of the things that has been undergirding a lot of my other thinking, a lot of my other research, these questions about where the technological systems that we depend on come from.
This is super exciting, and of course we'll talk about Mumford a little bit more in detail later on. But Kevin, I want to ask you the same question. I think we probably had this conversation in a bar in Zurich at some point, right? As to what kind of things do you read and what inspires you in this reading?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think, I mean, I really love this question because it makes me think about what links, kind of the various bodies of work that I've drawn on in my work around sort of disasters, emergency governance, and especially community resilience recently. And so the stuff that I read ranges really widely. I'm not only a geographer, but I'm a really poor geographer because I tend to read everyone but geographers. But, everything, my work ranges from, so the post-structural continental philosophy of Deleuze, Guattari, and Foucault, autonomous Marxism of Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, critical indigenous theory of Elizabeth Povinelli, Caribbean studies, Black geographies, scholarship from folks like Deborah Thomas, Catherine McKittrick, Christina Sharp, Saidiya Hartman, Jovan Lewis, and Alex Moulton's work, especially on Black ecologies and maroon ecologies, is really inspiring in a lot of ways. I think what unites, kind of my work around all of this is essentially the way that, this writing has all, at various junctures in my career, helped me make sense of experiences that I have when I'm out conducting research, doing interviews with folks, doing participant observation, ethnographic research, learning from people's experiences and being presented with events that kind of challenge our taken for granted narratives. And so I think, this is something that I learned really early on when I first began conducting, my, very qualitative work on disasters. But when you're on the ground doing research, there's always these kinds of weird moments that stick out. That kind of, and for me, it's always this kind of feeling of unease I have that something happened that doesn't make sense, and that we have to do something to explain it. And so I go out and I read until I find something that helps me make sense of things. And so just really quickly, one of these little moments, that was really formative in my career took place during my dissertation research with Jamaica's National Disaster Management Agency. And so, I was working as a volunteer with their projects division. We'd been conducting, some transect walks throughout Somerset, which is this tiny community in the foothills of the Blue Mountains. And, it was part of a UK Department for International Development funded community disaster resilience project that was all about empowering local communities, kind of like giving voice to their experiences, that kind of thing. And we'd been walking in the hills like all day, and this was, sort of mid-August. It was the worst time to be doing this kind of work in Jamaica. And we were finally on the bus ride going back to Kingston, discussing kind of like what we had learned and seen while we were out there. And, we were all exhausted, so we were all kind of turned to complaining a bit. And one woman who was a manager, essentially shouted out something along the lines of, God, this would all be so much easier if these people would just do what we told them to do. And, it was kind of something where everyone laughed a bit, but I think there was a little kernel of truth in that joke, because there, it spoke to this kind of, power relationship that was ongoing within disaster management, particularly at the time, in the early 2010s when resilience was becoming a thing. It was being picked up. People didn't quite know what was going on. And yet here you have all this talk in the field promoting resilience. This is great. This is empowering. And yet we have at the same time, these disaster management professionals who are saying, God, these community members, like, what is going on? Why won't they just listen to us? And so this is a classic example kind of this, sort of power dynamic that's in play that we see in a lot of different fields, whether we're looking at kind of engineering and technology to environmental management to disaster management. And there's these power knowledge imbalances. And, it's tempting to overlook something like that and to focus on, what our narrative tells us that we already know very well, right? Like, let's look at the history of capitalist exploitation in the region. Let's look at the history of uneven development. But there's something else going on here as well, too. And it was kind of that dis-ease of her joke that really inspired me to kind of read more widely. And this made me turn to the literature on biopolitics that had been coming out at the time. And so it was just that kind of that contingent, sort of like moment in the field where I now had to sit back and kind of reassess a lot of what had been, what we had been told in prevailing narratives, and to really kind of read widely beyond disaster studies and beyond what was at the time, sort of even the dominant, sort of research in geography and political geography, which is my field of specialization, reading beyond that as well, too, to try and find theoretical frameworks that can make sense. And so ever since then, I've always tried to be really attuned to these experiences that don't fit. Like, what's that one sort of odd experience out that doesn't exactly fit with everything that you've been told, everything that we teach ourselves, everything we tell ourselves about the nature of the work that we do. And so that's really inspired me to continue reading, not just, sort of the work on biopolitics and assemblage that I found really useful in explaining the Jamaican case and my experiences in Jamaica, but reading more widely around Caribbean studies, Black studies more broadly, to look at the way that these, these power knowledge dynamics continue playing out, not only in disaster management and development throughout the Jamaica and the Caribbean, but even in urban resilience planning initiatives nowadays in cities across North America, Europe, and around the world.
Amazing. I love this. And also this reminded me of University of West Indies bookshop, which is like the best bookshop ever, because you can only get those books there, right? Published by the University of West Indies. But it's, yeah, every time I go there, I kind of spend my monthly salary, but what do we do? But yeah, thanks both for sharing this. This is great.
Yeah, I think it's really cool to hear from the guests each week at the beginning, just on the importance of reading outside of your field, outside of disaster studies, if that's something you identify with. Definitely was kind of a setting off point for this volume for us, but I think we're hearing from people, depending on their, disciplinary background. Most of our guests so far have had that kind of moment where they just realize they need to explore outside, and it's brought a lot of richness to all of our work. So I think it's fantastic. So we want to talk about the entries that you both have been working on for this volume in the next 20 or so minutes. And I want to start with you, Zachary, because you not only wrote one, but two entries for us. you wrote about Lewis Mumford, who you mentioned already. And I think there was some competition for this one. We had several people that wanted to write about Mumford.
Beating for it.
And you also wrote about Paul Virilio. And so we wanted to just ask you, why did you offer to write about both of these thinkers?
So the first and kind of obvious answer I have to give is that anytime I have an opportunity to write about Lewis Mumford, I will take it. It's I think that anybody who has taken a class with me is kind of like sick of the Mumford references getting like squeezed in, or somebody says something and I'm like, oh, who said something like that, or oh, this sounds kind of like this, or so on the one hand, I'm never going to miss an opportunity to write about him, and hearing that there was competition, both on the one hand makes me very flattered that I was able to write the entry, and it's also like, yeah, we should be reading Mumford. It's good to see some of this competition, and I think, in terms of your earlier question, in some ways Mumford is a great person to read widely with, because he was kind of a thinker in a mode of talking about lots and lots of stuff, like very much the model of a public intellectual who did not feel themselves to be constrained to one area or another. If you look at his entire body of work, there is important early work that he's doing on kind of the history of American literature. He's writing about modern art. He's writing about cities and urbanism. He's writing about technology. There is so much different stuff in Mumford. And one of the things that I often find interesting in encountering various other people who work on him in one way or another is that there's often a tendency to kind of talk about Mumford, the scholar of American literature, or Mumford, the historian of technology, or Mumford, the scholar of urbanism, or Mumford, the utopian. And I also think, and one of the things that I was trying to push a little bit in the short essay, is that I think that there's a lot to be said for also looking at him as a theorist of disaster and catastrophe. He's somebody who frequently talks about seeing himself very much in the model of the prophet Jonah, and very much seeing himself in the model of somebody who is trying to warn against things that are coming, things that are going to go wrong in the years ahead, unless something is done. And so I think that in terms of that question of the warning that is heeded, the warning that is unheeded, what are you warning about? I think that that's a question which, at least for me, I find very interesting in kind of a tangential way to broader disaster studies questions, because as I think we've all encountered in our work and so much of the excellent work in the field, when disasters occur, one of the things that often occurs is a little bit of a how did this happen? How come we didn't see this coming? And so I think that it's really interesting to look at the people who did see something coming, who do try to warn about it, and whether or not they are heeded or not. And this is really something that Mumford was very, very wrapped up in himself. This question of how how do you get people to listen? How do you get these messages across? I just had an article come out recently that's about Mumford's relationship with Erich Fromm, and it's based on their friendship. And in the letters that were going back and forth between the two of them in their correspondence, so much of what they're doing with each other is just kind of this question of, in some ways it gets, interestingly, at what you were saying, Kevin, this question of how do we get people to listen? Why aren't people listening? What is the point of trying to sound the alarm if nobody listens? With, of course, then when you actually dig into the work and you see the things that they are warning about, well, some of the things that they are warning about, some of the things that they're saying are bad, are dangerous, aren't necessarily the things that other people are saying are are risky and dangerous. But to kind of bring that back together, I do think that in terms of looking at Mumford in the context of disasters, his attention to technology, his attention to cities, and his attention to the way that complicated technological systems are formed, and then the ways in which they are consistently reified throughout society, and the various sorts of dangers that that creates going forward, I think can be very useful to think with and very challenging to think with. So that's kind of the Mumford side there. I feel like I could easily just keep going on and on about him, so I'll hit the pause button. But in terms of Virilio, and I actually came prepared for this session so that I wouldn't just be paraphrasing it. He's responsible for a quotation that, if I'm honest, I can't remember the first time I encountered it, but it has been the question that like has always been in the back of my mind ever since I first encountered it. And it's so I'm quoting now: unless we are deliberately forgetting the invention of the shipwreck and the invention of the ship, or the rail accident and the advent of the train, we need to examine the hidden face of new technologies before that face reveals itself in spite of us. And this is a formulation which appears repeatedly throughout his body of work in various forms with various examples slipped in and out. But one of the things that I've always just found really fascinating about that kind of thinking is this idea that when you invent something new, what are the sorts of risks? What are the sorts of dangers? What are the sorts of wrecks that are getting invented alongside it? And certainly there are certain things, you know, from the example he gave of like, well, we have the shipwreck or we have like the train crash. You know, in some cases we have these terms that very neatly sum it up. But one of the things that I've been really interested in exploring in a lot of my own work is, okay, so what's then like the original accident of the computer? You know, is it just the computer crash? Is that kind of like too big, too vague? How, when we are thinking about the creation of new sorts of technology, new sorts of technological systems, as we are becoming dependent on those, what are the risks that are getting invented alongside of them? What are the potential wrecks that are looming in the future? And if you are thinking in terms of what is the future crash being invented, you know, what are the steps you need to take along the way to prevent it?
Like, to me, that brings up, a lot of, like, certainly at UF, I can speak at UF, everything's like about AI. Every discipline is getting their, hiring around AI. A lot of the applicants who are going for faculty positions are like writing their CVs around this interest. So I'm wondering, what recs are we inventing in the current? Any thoughts on that, Zachary?
Uh, oh boy, so many thoughts. And because I feel like the context allows it, I cannot miss the opportunity to say that if we're thinking about kind of past warnings about stuff like this, and we're thinking about AI, people should absolutely be revisiting the warnings and writings of Joseph Weizenbaum from the 1970s about the rise of AI, the risks it represented, an extremely prescient thinker, somebody who was himself a very early and important figure in AI. He invents the first chatbot and very quickly is like, whoa, I don't like the way that people are interacting with this. And I'm sorry, I know you all saw this coming. Weizenbaum, of course, friends with Lewis Mumford, inspired by Lewis Mumford. Just throwing that in there as well. I mean, I think that this question of what are the dangers that we are creating through the new levels of dependency? What are the larger societal effects? Who is benefiting? Who is being harmed? I also think that when it comes to something like this, and we're seeing some of the areas where the frontline harms are really being seen and really being felt, it's also an area where it can be really useful to kind of have this split between, okay, how is it being talked about by like the people who are selling it versus how are the risks being talked about by the way that like a lot of people are like seeing it. And one of the things that I think about here, especially in regards to AI, is that it seems to me like so many of the people who are really at the front lines of AI's impacts right now are artists and educators, artists who are really seeing some of their livelihood being taken up by generative AI, or artists who are
Mm.
directly seeing, oh, I can see that my work has been stolen and incorporated into this. And then at the flip side, uh, educators, I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody else in this conversation, but I imagine that uh, many of us, educators more broadly, are grappling with this issue in real time as we are encountering students who are submitting AI generated work, who are relying more and more on AI. And these questions of not just these kind of hyperbolic risks of Terminator or The Matrix, but also just like these seemingly banal but much more serious questions of, what does it mean that our students no longer know how to formulate an argument on their own? And of course, there's, a large, excellent, very important body of work related to AI risks. Scholars like Sophia Noble, Meredith Broussard, Ruha Benjamin, so much great, important work being looked at, looking at kind of algorithmic risk, looking at all of these dangers, particularly as they relate to AI. And I think that part of this is kind of responding a little bit to that almost like Virilio-esque question of like, okay, can we pay attention to what the dangers are at the
Mm.
beginning? Can we pay attention to what the risks are at the beginning? Although I'm afraid that too often it feels that people are kind of taken in by the goodies and the promises of what they're going to get, so that they don't really want to recognize the risks until the crash, and then everybody will sit around going, how come nobody warned us?
Yeah, I think Ksenia, I definitely love to sit with folks that talk about risk as a construct over time, and to that extent, it's important to be a historian of risk, and I think that shows up in your entries, Zachary. How do you feel that disaster scholars really need to assume that kind of responsibility to be a historian of risk to some degree in their work?
So obviously I'm biased. I'm a historian by training, and I teach in a history department. So I feel like if I'm not going to say nice things about history, I risk getting into a lot of trouble. Although, as I mentioned before, I have a background as a librarian. I also have a background in media studies. So I try and bring in various disciplinary perspectives and experiences. But I think that history is very important for disaster studies scholarship. And I think that scholars of disasters, even if they are not historians by training, tend to be very well attuned to history, because so much disaster studies scholarship recognizes that, like, it's not that everything was fine and then suddenly, a disaster happens and everybody goes, oh my gosh. You know, ideas like slow disaster that do so much to track how we set the conditions that then when X or Y triggering event happens, it turns into a disaster. Recognizing the long patterns that have been established by whatever different forces that we want to talk about that have kind of very much set the stage for then some kind of triggering event to result in disaster. Factors like poverty, redlining, all sorts of different things that have set up certain communities to be more adversely impacted, that have made it so that certain groups are going to be more at risk when a certain situation occurs. You know, when we're trying to make sense of how something happened, why something is having so much of an effect, or even why it was that buildings in a certain area are built not up to code, or why buildings were allowed to be constructed in an area that was, clearly unsafe for them. I think that we as a field recognize that you need to have some understanding of the history that gets us to this point, that the moment of disaster is not the whole story. It is one moment in a longer story which precedes the event and also continues after the event. That even after the TV cameras have gone home, even after so much of the media attention has quote unquote moved on from the disaster, as scholars working on disasters know, the disaster continues. Its effects persist. It continues to impact people's lives. And taking that very long view of disaster, both in terms of the history, in terms of the moment, and then into it, the future, I think that temporality is really key for disaster studies.
Super. And this temporality is also an excellent segue to Kevin's entries. So Kevin, you also did two entries for us, and you chose to write about Edward Soja. And then I may have accidentally volunteered you to also write about Doreen Massey. And this what happens when you start chatting to me via email. So why Soja and Massey?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I do still owe you this Massey entry, which I'm very excited to actually sit down and work on in the near future. But yeah, I think, Massey and Soja have always been, for me, I think some of the most creative and innovative thinkers in geography. They are two scholars who have just, when they were active in writing in the 1980s, 1990s, even before then as well and after, but they were just continuously pushing the boundaries of the field and kind of reinventing what the field could do, bringing in new scholars, new theories in just really creative ways that continue to resonate and continue to be incredibly relevant today, not only for folks in geography but beyond the discipline as well, for folks who are engaging with questions of both space and time. And so I think starting a little bit with Massey, I guess. Massey's 2005 book, For Space, is arguably, for me, the most important book that I've ever read. I think in a lot of ways, it's the book where I learned what it meant, for me at least, to be a geographer. What does it mean to be a geographer? When you're in geography, you have a kind of, I think a lot of folks have a kind of ingrained sense of an attunement to spatial difference. We like thinking about the difference that space makes. I love giving those intro to geography lectures, geography 100, intro to geography, world regional geography, like what makes geography different. We bring together a little bit of everything. We bring together politics, economics, sociology, cultural studies, anthropology, environmental studies. We bring everything together and we mix it up and we bring it together in order to understand place and to understand how place is constructed and difference that place and space make when we're thinking about what are the dynamics that shape, kind of our everyday lives. And so we have this kind of, just this little attunement, this sense that, we like space. But Massey in For Space gave us this just remarkable work of art, really, to kind of give us the ethical and the epistemological tools to really begin unpacking and pulling at and studying the difference that space makes in very kind of rigorous and ethically attuned and politically appropriate ways. And so For Space is, for Massey, the culmination of a lot of threads that she had been developing throughout her work, from her early work in the 70s and 80s on locality studies, up through her work on feminist geography in the 80s and 90s, through her work in the 90s and 2000s on bringing together theories of space and time in both physical geography and human geography. And the sense of space that she developed is one where she sees space not as the domain of kind of fixity and representation, with time being kind of the converse, the domain of dynamism and change, but rather Massey saw space as being the domain of contemporaneous multiplicity. It's, in other words, stuff changes. We have a future because there's a whole bunch of stuff that's mixed together and that sits uneasily within space. And so you can't just break time apart from space and say, well, time is where change happens. Space is over here. We can ignore that. Space is never static for Massey. It's always lively. It's always full of potential. And space, moreover, is formed by the intersection and the juxtaposition of multiple trajectories that come together in contingent ways. And so when we start thinking about this again, this gets back to kind of the sense that we have of, just there's a lot of stuff out there that we just don't know and that we never will know. And, you can think about it, the way that maybe a roadway, a store, an alleyway, it means one thing to us, it means something else completely different to someone, to someone else who's in that same space. And that's the juxtaposition of those coming together that give that space a liveliness, a potential to become something other than it is. Now, this doesn't mean that it always becomes something otherwise, but there's always that potential there to become otherwise. And so, Massey really kind of helps us see and theorize and understand, what it is that I think geographers love about space, just the way that it is, where we can see the possibility for difference embedded in our material world. And so, I love Massey's work for that because she helps us theorize space in these ways. And for me, that was just groundbreaking as a young geographer, as a master's student reading For Space for the first time. I was like, this is what I've been looking for. Like, I've been wanting to put it into words, and this just hit the nail on the head. And so I think, it's something that is always constantly present in my work, even if I don't explicitly sort of explain how I'm drawing on Massey, but she's always there in everything that I do when I'm thinking about the relationship between space-time and disasters and emergency today. And I think Soja is very much the same as Massey, but in maybe slightly different ways. Because I read Soja a bit later than I otherwise would have. I actually read him in detail for the first time, maybe like 5 years ago or so, which I'd read some of, a lot of his work on postmodern geographies, his engagements with Lefebvre and Foucault, kind of as a graduate student, but always kind of push it over in the corner there. I was working on Jamaican disasters and development, so just writing on Los Angeles and the city. So, you can kind of bracket that over to the side there. But I've been able to come back to his work recently, and it's just, honestly, it's remarkable how relevant his work, like Massey's, is to a lot of the debates and issues that we're dealing with now. And so I think the key thing that stands out for me in Soja, and I write about this in my entry, is the way that his work revolves around what he calls the right to difference within the discipline of geography. And I think this is absolutely essential because what he's getting at there is both a critique of the way that geographers construct knowledge about space and the role of geographers themselves as active agents in producing and limiting the kinds of knowledge that we're able to produce on space. So it's a kind of a two-pronged critique that he has going there with this idea of the right to difference. And so on one level, Soja developed this sense of the right to difference as a way of trying to open up geographic thought to a more diverse range of spaces. And he turned to Lefebvre's, spatial trialectics and Lefebvre's sense of lived space, which is very resonant with Massey's sense of space as contemporaneous multiplicity. This idea that, there's a liveliness to space that is irreducible to a single overarching definition. And that when we begin to think of space in terms of, its lived experience, we can see a wide range, an infinite, immeasurable sense of being and existence within space. And so we get a sense of space there again, like in Massey, as just filled with potential that we can never actually fully know what space means. But then when you follow that thread epistemologically in Soja's work, you get a sense that no, actually there's a whole lot of people out there who have a lot to say about space, who could tell us a lot about what space means, how they practice space, how they live the spaces of their everyday lives. And so it really blows open whose knowledge counts when you're thinking about space. And so one of the things that Soja did early on, far earlier than a lot of other folks working in the field of radical geography, which is a very white and male field for much of the 70s up through the 80s and the 90s. But Soja was one of the first folks to really start engaging seriously with Black studies scholars like Cornel West, Black feminist thinkers like Bell Hooks, and really bring their work in and use it not to say like this is what we're missing. Like now we can account for the Black sense of place. Haha, we've done it now. But to say, hey, there's a whole range of experiences out there that are unknowable and that we'll never know, and yet we can continue to push the boundaries of our thought by opening ourselves up to these different experiences and knowledges. And, as Zachary was saying, these different histories of space and spatiality. And so I think this is the key thing with Soja's work, is that when we start thinking about what it means to think spatially, we really have to spatialize thought. We really have to recognize and situate our own thought in the context in which we're writing and ask, what else is out there beyond us, not to bring it in and to say, now we've made a totalizing, truth statement. Now we've captured everything finally, but to say there's always something more that we're not going to know, that we can't fold into our knowledge system. And we should constantly be pushing ourselves to move beyond the limits of how we know and engage with the world out there, whether we're thinking in terms of space, time, disaster, emergency, technology, whatever it is. And I think it's important to note that, with Soja's work, it wasn't just about, opening up the theory and geographic thought to difference. Soja also did the work of actually trying to create the discipline in, sort of the everyday spaces of geography as well. He was the advisor of Clyde Woods, who was one of the key founders of Black geographic thought. And if you haven't read Clyde's work on the New Orleans disaster and rebuilding and the politics of rebuilding New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, which has been published in a variety of different outlets. But, Clyde brings a kind of, a Black geography's perspective to the question of disaster and disaster recovery that I think is essential, that I think still has a lot to offer, both geography and disaster studies. But Soja's work was about creating right to difference, both in geographic thought and within the discipline itself, which, it makes both Soja and Massey such really important thinkers, not only in their time, but also for the issues we're dealing with today.
For sure. And as you know, Kevin, West Chick and I have been kind of playing with Soja's ideas quite a lot and kind of trying to engage with them. And I'm always surprised how little engagement there is with Soja, actually. Somehow I don't quite understand why he's almost like overlooked, his work is overlooked. And so, open for debate. But something that you refer to a lot, well, unsurprisingly, given that you focused on Soja and Massey, is space. And I feel like in disaster scholarship, we're kind of relatively comfortable in the discussion of space, right? And I feel like we're not as comfortable in a discussion of time, apart from that, almost linear perception of disaster. Something started, then it happened, and then, something will kind of continue. So, in your opinion, how do we reconcile space and time in a way that we study disasters, in a way that would be meaningful for us?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it also kind of gets a little bit to the question of why Soja tends to be, I think, maybe a bit overlooked more perhaps than other scholars like Massey. But I think, Soja's sense of the sociospatial dialectic that he developed, really tried to invert, kind of like this kind of like, very kind of modernist fascination with time and temporality, and to bring the focus back onto space. And as some people would say, partly at the expense of thinking through and taking seriously time and temporality, and the way that space and time are not necessarily, dialectically, or not necessarily in a binary relationship with each other, but rather sort of dialectically mutually constitutive. And so I think, Massey's work in that sense is actually an outgrowth of a lot of the work that Soja was doing. And I think, Massey, in a sense, captured that sense of time in a way that Soja was kind of, maybe perhaps working towards a little bit, but had been constrained by a dialectical understanding of space and time. So there might be something there, I'm not sure. But I think now, when we're thinking this and we're thinking through, kind of the relationship between space and time, and thinking through, how can we begin taking time seriously? I think this is where, Soja's sense on spatializing thought is actually really relevant. Because what does it mean to spatialize our thought on time? I think this is something where the opening up thought to groups and to experiences and to histories that are perhaps under-recognized, under-acknowledged, can offer a lot to the way that we theorize space and time. And so for one quick example there, kind of playing a bit off of, what Zachary was talking about with the slow disasters work, we've done some work on slow emergencies with myself, Ben Anderson, Lauren Rickards, and Matt Kearns, where we really take seriously what it means to think about time within emergencies. And we don't necessarily call it spatializing time, but in a way that's kind of what we're doing, where, we're kind of taking this assumption that there's one particular time, the time of emergency, that there's a single kind of like temporality. We have the disaster cycle, right? We have sort of the lead in, we have the preparations, we have the warning, we have the event itself, then we have the emergency response, and then we have the reconstruction, which leads back into the preparedness. And this kind of like cycles through this very kind of like predictable time where we're able to manage, an emergent and constantly uncertain future through the tools and techniques of disaster studies, right? But what if we began to recognize and begin to draw in other work on time, such as work from scholars in Caribbean studies like Deborah Thomas, scholars in Block studies like Christina Sharp, Catherine McKittrick, that would question kind of like a single homogeneous experience of time and temporality within modernity. And I think their work really, especially Deborah Thomas's work, really draws attention to the way that modern experience of time with the future as this kind of open-ended futurity, where we're able to kind of, make an intervention in the present that will have some kind of effect in the future, and we can strategically kind of game out what effect that will have so that we can live within an uncertain future. This was an experience of time that was historically conditioned by the plantation system, by the violence of the plantation system. This was an experience of time, this modern experience of time that emerged, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and became something that was created on the backs, quite literally, of people working in plantation fields, of enslaved laborers in the plantation, whose labor created the material conditions for some to experience, time as open-ended. They were able to actually create a future. They were able to improve their situation, their lot in life, because they benefited materially from the plantation economies and from the violence of the plantation. Mm. And so when you begin to think of time, this sense of time that we take for granted now, just the future, we can intervene in the future, we can improve the future. Well, this has always been dependent on the denial of that same experience of time, that same experience of the future from those whose labor makes the material conditions of futurity possible. And so we can look at that the way that recurs throughout history, from the plantation violence in which enslaved populations on the plantation were creating the material conditions for European plantation owners to experience the future as open-ended, when they were denied the same experience of time. Similar experiences today, if we read Afro-pessimist work, from folks like Sadia Hartman, from folks like Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton, they draw out other experiences of temporality that are just as modern as what we think of as modern time, but are not incorporated within that dominant modernist temporal imaginary. So you have the temporalities of repetition, where you have the continued cycling of anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence, that creates the continued material conditions for futurity. And you have the temporality of duration, living in the suspended present, where there is no promise of a better future. There is no promise of a better world to come. You're just suspended in the immediacy of trying to survive in unlivable conditions and create, little pockets and windows of joy and hope within an otherwise toxic environment of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. And so, when we begin to think about time in those cases, we can begin to think about the way that disaster is, in many ways, kind of an interweaving of these multiple temporalities. And so we can bring it back to both Soja in terms of spatializing time to recognize these multiple experiences of time embedded within our present, but then also, bringing in Massey and thinking through the contemporaneous juxtaposition of multiple temporalities, how temporalities of modern futurity intersect with temporalities of repetition and temporalities of of duration to create disaster events that are unfolding in everyday lived spaces.
So cool.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin and Zachary. Really good to hear your insights on like what inspired you to write these entries. I'm so looking forward to putting these out there, getting them published, because I can't wait for more people to engage with all of the ideas that our guests are bringing forward in these live streams, and so many more. So many people that are not going to be on the live streams that have contributed. We're excited about it. Just in terms of bringing new ideas to people that may not have read and giving people new reading lists. We always love to give people new ideas for reading lists. It's like never ending. But I wanted, just in the 10 minutes we have left, to ask you for some final thoughts on like what you're hoping for disaster scholarship moving forward, and maybe just like in the context of this book, this collection, that's trying to encourage people to read more widely. Like, what are your hopes for the field? Zachary, maybe first of all.
So, also, always a fan of encouraging people to read widely. I think that too often I engage with people by responding to questions, by recommending books to them, which is again the curse of a background as a librarian. I think that of all of the questions from today, in some ways this is the one that I find hardest to answer, just because on the one hand, as I think about the future of the field and the future of the work that we do, there's a part of me that just wishes that it didn't feel as vital and as important as it does right now. It feels to me like we are living in the midst of a period of so many disasters that are piling on top of each other. And I know that, speaking as a historian, sometimes it almost feels like, in looking backwards at things in the past, that it is doing so in a very, very privileged position where you are ignoring so many of the disasters that are unfolding as we speak. And I recognize that this is something that I don't exactly know where you go from that, or what you do with that. I mean, I suppose that this is uh, a plea which I imagine that us and many of the contributors to the book are aware of, that like what we do as scholars is important, but what we do as human beings is also important beyond that as well. But in terms of actually answering the question, I think that one of my hopes, and one of the things that I find so exciting about the disaster studies field, one of the things that makes me so hopeful about this book, is that I think it is a very rich interdisciplinary space. And I think that there is so much that we are gaining from reading widely, from speaking widely, to interacting with scholars who work on disasters, but looking at disasters from lots of different angles. And so I think that that's something that I think makes the field very vibrant. And one of the things that I certainly hope for the future is that as a field, we're able to maintain this kind of interdisciplinary richness, where there is these open lines of communication and collaboration between people doing disaster work in all of these different registers, because I think that we have so much to learn from each other and share with each other. And also just hoping that we can continue to make important interventions, whether in public discussions and public policies, or even just in the lives of our students. All of our students are also living through this period of multiple overlapping disasters. And I think that providing them To get back to Kevin's point about reading something that helps you kind of make sense of the world, I think that so often introducing our students to some of the thinking and theorizing around disasters can actually really provide them with a vocabulary to understand the moment in history that they are living through.
Yeah, thanks, Zachary. Kevin, what about you?
Yeah, thanks, Zachary. That was really well said. I mean, I think, I think, we're living in this moment now where it's just, one unfolding crisis compounded after another unfolding crisis. And so we're just pinballing from, it feels like catastrophe to catastrophe now, right? I mean, I think, I'm jealous looking at you guys, Zachary and Jason, because, my beard used to be like, sort of brown as well. And then, like COVID happened, and then, the fascism happened. And so like everything's just like completely going gray and all that. So yeah, it's, we wear, sort of the histories that we live through, sort of on our bodies in various ways, right? But I think, we're still in a reparative moment, which I think is something that really matters. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because everything's kind of like, feels like everything's being, kind of like torn down, everything's, sort of coming unglued, but it's being torn down because we're in this reparative moment where people are taking seriously like the limitations of, our modern world and the limitations of our modern systems that, structure our everyday lives and our everyday existence, and are pushing on those limitations and are doing the labor of making a better world and making a more inclusive world. And, that's why people are trying to blow up this world now, because they can't cope with that change. And so I think, it's important to continue doing that work of building bridges. Building bridges within our disciplines, as Zachary was saying, building bridges, with our students, ensuring that they have the conceptual tools to make sense out of what's going on. And building bridges is something also that helps, kind of work against that, really that nihilistic drive to basically, to encourage detachment, to encourage, stepping back and not being involved and not building relations. When we do the work of reaching out to our students, reaching out to our colleagues, reaching out across disciplines, this is what brings people together, and this is what Making Worlds is built out of, is, building those relations. And that's why everything that we're seeing going on right now is trying to destroy and tear down and, eliminate our capacities to build relations. And so I think, where I see the hope for the field, and where, I'd like to see, disaster studies and disaster scholarship and practice going, is to continue this work of building bridges that's been going on. Sort of the Radical Disaster Studies Manifesto, the RADICS Manifesto, is a really important statement that seeks to, tear down disciplinary barriers between the academy and between society, and that's an important bridge building activities and relation building activities that need to continue. And I think, the work that this book is doing as well too, and encouraging those connections to be drawn across diverse disciplines. Reading disaster studies, but then reading beyond disaster studies as well is important. And I think it's important for other disciplines as well too to engage with disaster studies. Bridges need to be two-way streets. And a lot of the work that disaster studies scholars have been doing, over the last few decades is incredibly relevant today, as Zachary was saying. Mm-hmm. And yet it's often pigeonholed within a very, very specific corner of modern academia. And so I think we need, hopefully, events and resources like this podcast are helping to kind of build those bridges across a variety of different disciplines, because we're only going to get stronger as we continue building those relations across our fields.
Phew. Wow, this has been amazing. Jason and I often say that this podcast is kind of the best thing that happens to us at work, and I think this conversation is a definite testament to that. So, Kevin, Zachary, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for writing for us, and just genuinely for writing and producing all the work that you do. It's been great talking to you today.
Thank
And
you.
for those of you who've been watching us or who are listening us, thank you for joining. And please join us again on Monday, 28th of April, when we will be talking about anarchism. Yeah. See you later. Bye.
Everyone.
Thanks. Bye.